The Lun-class Ekranoplan is a remarkable and unusual machine that blurred the boundary between an aircraft and a ship. Secretly developed in the Soviet Union from the 1980s onward, it was a ground effect vehicle that utilized an aerodynamic phenomenon called ground effect to attain high speeds while flying just above the water's surface. It exemplified the extreme measures both sides of the Cold War took in creating new weapons and technology to surpass each other. The origins of the Lun-class trace back to the broader concept of the Ekranoplan itself. During the 1960s, the Soviets began experimenting with a novel design known as the KM, or the model ship. The Soviet government had taken an interest in testing the principles of a ground effect vehicle, GEV. The concept was that a GEV could function similarly to a plane, but take advantage of ground effect to glide just a few meters above the surface rather than the thousands of feet in the air, primarily over water. The Soviets theorized that a GEV would achieve high speeds while remaining difficult to detect by radar due to both its low altitude and certain stealthy design characteristics. The Soviet government assigned the Russian Central Hydrofoil Design Bureau to develop this new design, appointing engineer Rostislav Alexeyev as its chief designer. Work on the new GEV craft commenced in 1964. The KM's design philosophy was based on scientific findings that demonstrated when aircraft fly close to the ground, they experience reduced drag due to airflow interacting with the surface below. This effect generates additional lift, allowing an Ekranoplan to have smaller wings as long as it remains near the ground. A vast body of water, such as the Caspian Sea, was an ideal testing ground for this theory. Completed in 1966, the KM was, at the time, the world's largest aircraft, measuring 100 feet in length. However, the Soviets regarded it more as a boat due to its wingless, waterborne design. The Soviet government later transferred control and upkeep of the KM to the Russian Navy instead of the Air Force. In June 1966, the KM was towed along the Volga River to begin its first trials on the Caspian Sea, which the Soviets believed had the ideal conditions to test both its water and air performance. In 1967, a CIA spy satellite captured an image of the completed Ekranoplan docked at a Soviet facility. The American government was baffled by the sight of what appeared to be a massive aircraft without wings, yet seemingly capable of flight. It was dubbed the Caspian Sea Monster, a name that would later be applied to other Soviet Ekranoplan designs. The Soviets continued testing the KM for different roles until it crashed into the water during a trial in 1980. No lives were lost in the incident, but the KM was declared beyond repair, and the Soviets deemed it too heavy and damaged to recover. It remained afloat for a week before eventually sinking to the bottom of the Caspian Sea. Despite this setback, the Soviets pressed on and used the KM's design as a foundation for a new Ekranoplan. Learning from the KM's shortcomings, they developed a new design under the designation Project 903. This new model was built as a smaller Ekranoplan and powered by 8 Kuznetsov NK-87 turbofan engines, delivering a total thrust of 62,000 pounds. It also featured a hull similar to a flying boat, improving its hydrodynamics and water landing capability. Project 903 was named the Lun, Russian for Harrier. Though smaller than the KM, the Lun-class was still a massive machine. It measured 240 feet long and 62 feet tall, with a wingspan of 144 feet and a top speed of 340 miles per hour. It was designed to be highly maneuverable, boasting a turning radius of 1,476 feet. Additionally, it could take off and land on water, making it ideal for coastal operations and quickly transporting personnel or cargo across a lake or short sea route. The first Lun-class variant was built for surface-to-air combat, featuring 6 missile and rocket launchers mounted on the fuselage to carry the P-270 Mosket-guided missile. Construction was completed in 1987, and the aircraft entered service in 1989 under the designation MD-160. As planned, it operated with the Soviet Navy, patrolling the Caspian Sea as part of the Navy's Caspian Flotilla Division. Western analysts assigned the MD-160 the NATO codename Duck, and it remained an object of fascination for both Eastern and Western aviation enthusiasts. Despite the Ekranoplan's innovative design, the Lun-class encountered several challenges during its service. Crews observed that while the ground effect allowed it to fly beneath radar detection, its short wingspan meant it could not rise more than 5 to 10 feet above the water without risking loss of control and crashing. As a result, the Lun could only be deployed when the Caspian Sea was calm, and in rough conditions, it had to be stored ashore. In addition to being difficult to operate on turbulent waters, the Lun-class had another limitation. It was designed to function solely using ground effect and could not achieve full flight like a conventional aircraft, even with its powerful engines. The Lun's dependence on good weather and its inability to rise above rough conditions significantly restricted both the seasons and locations where it could operate effectively. A second Lun-class Ekranoplan was planned by the Soviet Ministry of Defense as a search and rescue craft. Construction began in the late 1980s, and it was named Spasatel, meaning rescuer, to reflect its intended role before Soviet authorities decided it would instead serve as a floating field hospital. By the late 1980s, most of the Spasatel's airframe was completed, but the project was abruptly paused and later canceled in 1991 following the Soviet Union's collapse. With the Cold War ending, both sides reduced military stockpiles, and Russia's struggling economy left no room for large, costly projects. Discussions have occasionally resurfaced in both government and private sectors about completing the Spasatel, but no plans have materialized. The fully operational Lun-class Ekranoplan was decommissioned in the 1990s, having never seen actual combat. It was towed to a naval station in Kaspisk, Russia, where it was stripped of key components and left idle. Over time, the unused Ekranoplan began to deteriorate, with rust forming due to prolonged exposure to the elements, despite calls for its preservation. In 2020, the Lun-class was slated for restoration, and a flotilla consisting of 3 tugboats, 2 naval escort vessels, and floating pontoons was assembled to transport the MD-160 to a new location. The plan was to relocate the Ekranoplan to Derbent for display at the proposed Patriot Park, an open-air museum dedicated to Soviet and Russian military equipment. During transport, the MD-160 was unintentionally beached before reaching Derbent and remained stuck in the sand despite repeated attempts to dislodge it. The stranded Ekranoplan quickly became a tourist attraction, drawing aviation enthusiasts and urban explorers eager to see the infamous Caspian Sea monster up close. However, its new location left it even more vulnerable to waves and storms than in Kaspisk, and reports surfaced that it was taking on water. In December 2020, the Ekranoplan was finally freed, though it had taken water into its tail section and was towed out nose first to resume its journey. It now rests on dry land in preparation for public exhibition. Although it never saw active deployment, the Lun-class remains a remarkable machine that represents a distinctive chapter in aviation history. Designed and constructed during a period of intense military rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States, its engineering and capabilities were nothing short of extraordinary. While the ground effect vehicle concept fell out of favor after the Lun-class's retirement and its service revealed certain limitations, its legacy continues to inspire engineers and aviation enthusiasts. Since then, design teams in Singapore, the United States, China, and Russia have explored various projects and prototypes based on the ground effect principle, with the potential to revive Ekranoplans, this time for civilian rather than military use.
So many of the ingenious designs for aircraft put to paper throughout history never came into production or often died at the prototype stage. Some of these aircraft became conceptual legends, and others were instead renowned to their absurdity. The Bartini VVA-14 is a bit of both, not least because of its purpose and the colorful inventor behind its design. Perhaps the best means of understanding the genius behind the plane is to understand the genius behind its creator, Roberto Bartini. Bartini was born in the infamous city of Fiume, in what was then Italy and is currently modern-day Croatia. He would live through the early part of the 20th century through political uproar and the reorganization of states and borders that took place as a result of the First World War. He showed a passion for aviation early on in life, and more specifically for innovative aircraft designs and concepts, a passion which would lead to the Italian engineer to the Soviet Union. Eager to complete his studies, Bartini moved to Italy to attend aerospace engineering courses at Milan's Polytechnic Institute as well as flight school near Rome. He joined the revolutionary aircraft manufacturer Caproni, where he worked alongside his mentor, the creative genius Giovanni Caproni. During his time at Caproni, Bartini was instrumental in making key innovations and design improvements in a number of the company's aircraft. However, Bartini's life would change completely when he was offered the opportunity to participate in aeronautical research in the Soviet Union. Fascinated by the career opportunities and prospects, Bartini accepted the offer. However, his decision to leave Italy was layered. Post-World War I Italy was politically and economically unstable. Furthermore, Bartini was an avid socialist and felt that the Soviet philosophy of strongly supporting scientific innovation would create potential for significant advancements in new aircraft technologies. From the moment Bartini arrived in the Soviet Union, he found himself directly involved in a variety of important projects. He began research at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, known by the acronym TSAGI, in Moscow, where he contributed greatly to a number of aircraft designs and concepts. However, Bartini had a knack for innovation and showed a notable prowess in engineering that caused him to stand out compared to his colleagues. He was quickly recognized for his notable mind when it came to aeronautics. His creativity and inventiveness earned him a reputation as a man with an unconventional but effective approach to aircraft design. Before he ever began work on the Bartini Biriev, he designed the Bartini Stal 7, an elegantly designed, twin-engine, flying-wing transport aircraft, which would act as an inspiration for the Year 2 and the Year 4. Although the plane never went into production, it displayed the Italian engineer's uncanny ability to bring an unconventional aircraft design to life in a manner that similar engineers of his day were unable to do at that time. During the 1930s, Bartini started working on what would be the genesis of his masterpiece, the Bartini Biriev VVA-14 submarine hunter. Bartini began researching seaplanes and amphibious aircraft for their dual civilian and military applications. His earlier designs made use of retractable landing gear and hulls which were optimal for waterborne operations. Bartini's seaplane concepts were seen as impressive for their time and earned him a significant status amongst his peers. World War II would see Bartini's expertise come center stage. His contributions were essential to the Soviet Union's war effort. His experience was put to use on a myriad of projects, which included strategic bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. While Bartini's career was ultimately marked with success during his time in the Soviet Union, he did, however, experience difficulties in his personal life. He underwent uncomfortable periods of political scrutiny and surveillance during the iron-fisted years of Stalin's regime. Yet, Bartini managed to navigate the complex maze of Soviet politics and ultimately preserve his position as a respected aeronautical engineer. The apex of Bartini's career would be his work on the Bartini VVA-14 submarine hunter, a conceptual design which he began working on in the late 20th century. Even by today's standards, it was a marvel of engineering and design, capable of landing on any surface and taking off from any position. The VVA-14 was a vertical takeoff amphibious aircraft. It was a highly experimental plane developed by the Soviet Union. It was intended to harness the abilities of a high-velocity aircraft combined with those of a seaplane. It also took advantage of the ground effect, compressing air in order to create a cushion between it and the water, meaning it could effectively function as a ship if needed. The question remains, why did Moscow want Bartini's plane design to have so many different capabilities? The answer, anti-submarine warfare, or ASW for short. And who better to design such a plane than one of the foremost amphibian aircraft experts in the world? The project began in the 1960s. Its scope was to create a submarine hunting aircraft that could operate in vastly different environments, from remote areas to coastal regions and large bodies of water. The VVA-14 had a uniquely long range and the ability to fly at unusually high speeds, while carrying a large payout of radar equipment and other reconnaissance technology. The VVA-14's central fuselage extended forwards and backwards, housing the cockpit and engines. The wings were mounted above the fuselage with two pontoons directly beneath them. The pontoons not only allowed for water takeoffs and landings, but also provided extra fuel storage and contained regular landing gear as well. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the plane, especially at the time it was conceived, was its VTOL functions. The VVA-14 used a special propulsion system to enable this. The plane came with two separate engine types, lift engines and cruising engines. The lift engines were located in the fuselage and could rotate to create vertical thrust for sustained hovering and VTOL capabilities. The engines responsible for lift were typically turbo engines, like the colossal RD-36-35, and they were potentially capable of producing a titanic 8,800 pounds of thrust. Instead, horizontal flying relied on turbofan cruise engines in the fuselage, like the Lyuka AL-7F. These engines produced a whopping 20,000 pounds of thrust. Different prototypes of the VVA-14 varied in the quantity of these engines used. Once finally in flight, the VVA-14's wings could rotate into position, and the lift engines would reposition into a horizontal configuration. The cruise engines would then take off the forward flight function. The VVA-14's VTOL capability would have made it ideal for operating in extremely unconventional environments, where other planes could not actively take off and land, such as bodies of water. This functionality also made the aircraft highly fuel efficient. The plane had channels which directed air beneath it, creating a cushion or a gap which effectively allowed the VVA-14 to act as a hovercraft and therefore ship on the water. Overall, the plane's test runs were not unpromising. It reached an impressive top speed of 550 kilometers an hour. For a plane of its size, and water taxiing had proven relatively successful. Perhaps most notable of all was the plane's odd design. Aside from being a truly hulking vehicle, it looked extremely modern for its time. The VVA-14 looked more like a comic book spaceship than a conventional airplane, with its back-mounted boosters and W-shaped body. This unique aesthetic was typical for Bartini's aircraft, which often sat at the cutting edge of aeronautical design. The conceptual outlines for the Beriev BE-1 and Beriev BE-2500 reflected the very same ingenuity and prowess. Bartini's concept was undoubtedly a theoretically perfect answer to an increasingly hard-fought war against submarine technology. However, his prototype airplanes did not come without their significant challenges and technical problems. One major issue was the plane's VTOL flight. The batteries needed to power the lift engines were never delivered. Therefore, the Kolsov RD-36-35 was never used to help the plane take off or land vertically. The aircraft's highly complex design led to stability and control problems. Its unconventional configuration, using a variety of different engines, resulted in an inability to reach optimal stability. Furthermore, the plane's complexity meant maintenance was a nightmare. The engine's swiveling mechanisms added yet another layer of difficulty to properly maintaining and repairing the plane, all while raising the number of potential points of failure. Like any project, the VVA-14 suffered from budgeting issues. The costs of developing and testing the aircraft required multiple expensive prototypes, and Bartini's innovations, while genius, were extremely costly. Ultimately, the VVA-14 sucked up more resources than could be appropriately allocated to it. This is in part what led to the project's cancellation, especially given that the increased funding needed could not be justified against the other Cold War expenses. In the end, priorities in the military were changing, and the Soviet Union and Navy decided to focus on entirely different types of aircraft. The project was slowly deprioritized and cancelled. Bartini's submarine hunting beast never saw operational duty and ultimately fell to the wayside, ending up in a museum of aeronautics in Moscow, a shell and a memory of the tireless work that went into creating an entirely new species of aircraft. However, despite the plane's ultimate failure as a project, Bartini's innovations and concepts were some of the most riveting and impressive for their time. He remains one of the earliest proponents of VTOL flight and highly avant-garde by today's standards. Roberto Bartini knew how to push the boundaries in a way that made him truly unique. His multidisciplinary approach incorporated disciplines from hydrodynamics to biomimicry. He turned to every source of inspiration he could in designing his planes. Perhaps that is why they were so futuristic. Maybe Bartini's VVA-14 went the way of all truly genius designs. Perhaps it was too ahead of its time. Shining a light on his ideas means his legacy can go on, and that the genius that went into making his aircraft was not lost in vain.
Flying boats have always been known for their great size. Up until World War II, they were seen as the only way to produce large aircraft. Post-war aviation, however, found little room for these leviathans. The future lay in faster, more efficient land planes. Nevertheless, a few designers refused to give way to progress. Just when the aviation world had forsaken the large flying boat, three of the biggest ones ever built would make their debut. Two would fade into oblivion. One is still flying today. A champion of flying boats, it is both a living relic and local hero. When man first sought to cross oceans by air rather than water, the logic of aircraft designers was simple enough. Build ships that can fly. With 75% of the world's surface as a ready-made runway, the giant flying boat was not only logical, but practical. And it would dominate aviation for the next 5 decades of powered flight. Today, flying boats are all but extinct. The smaller floatplane is but a distant reflection. This is Vancouver Island, British Columbia, off Canada's Pacific coast. Near the center, on one of its largest lakes, 2 dinosaurs are alive and well. These are the largest operational flying boats in existence. At 200 feet, their wingspan stretches wider than that of a 747 jumbo jet. Built over 50 years ago for the United States Navy, the Martin Mars was originally conceived as a long-range patrol bomber. Today, its enormous hull carries a bomb load not of armaments, but water, 30 tons, and the enemy, forest fires. Deemed obsolete by the Navy in 1956, the Mars escaped the scrap heap thanks to a group of Canadian logging companies. Now, with over 30 years of successful firefighting, the Mars water bomber is a living relic from an age when bigger was still considered better in designing flying boats. The first JRM Mars made its debut in July of 1945. At its christening, the theme was size. The Martin Company had planned quite a show for the U.S. Navy and national press. Master of Ceremonies Glenn L. Martin proudly prepared to launch the Navy's largest flying boat ever, soon to be one of its most successful. The ceremony seemed more befitting the christening of an ocean liner or battleship. But after all, the Mars was a ship with wings. And Martin saw it as the next step toward giant flying boat transports of the future. Aviation pioneer and avid proponent of flying boats, Martin had introduced the famous China Clipper here 10 years earlier. Now he enjoyed introducing the first of 20 JRMs ordered by the Navy, whose confidence was based on the wartime success of the prototype seen here joining the ceremony. The prototype Mars XPB-2M had been ordered by the Navy as early as 1938. It took 3 years to complete before it was finally launched at Middle River, Maryland. Once delivered to the Navy, it would be the largest patrolled bomber in World War II with the greatest range, over 4,900 miles. Its giant 200-foot wing held 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower. For the next month, engine and system tests were conducted until the XPB-2M was ready for flight tests. But while still restricted to taxi tests, the Mars program suffered an unfortunate setback. On December 5, 1941, during engine tests, the No. 3 propeller refused to go into reverse. The engine soon caught fire and threw a propeller blade into the fuselage, nearly injuring the flight engineer. The anchor was removed, and the aircraft was run aground in an effort to save it. Before the fire could be extinguished, the No. 3 engine burned completely out of its mounts and fell to the ground. The fire was eventually put out, but the wing and engine nacelle suffered considerable damage, and the errant propeller had left a huge gash in the fuselage. But the crew had not lost the aircraft. Walking the wing from tip to tip, the engineers worked to unbeach the Leviathan from the river shore. In less than 30 days, repairs would be completed, and the Mars would be back for final testing. Fitted with a new No. 3 engine, the XPB-2M was ready for its first flight test on June 23, 1942. When flight tests were completed, the decision was made to convert the XPB-2M bomber into a transport aircraft. The bow and gun turret were subsequently removed, decking was reinforced, hatches added, and cargo loading equipment was installed. For the next 18 months, the XPB-2M remained at Martin for final conversion and testing. The Navy finally received its giant transport at Patuxent River, Maryland, on November 27, 1943. On temporary assignment there with the Naval Air Transport Service, the Old Lady, as she was affectionately dubbed, would make a record-breaking flight between Pax River and Natal, Brazil, a distance of 4,375 miles with a payload of 13,000 pounds. Just the start of many record-breaking flights for the Mars aircraft. By January of 1944, priority cargo was needed more than ever to supply the Allied island hopping campaign in the Pacific. As the Japanese were placed on the defensive, the Old Lady was used extensively between Alameda, California and Hawaii, the longest overwater air route in the world. From there, other naval air transport aircraft continued the journey flying supplies into forward areas for the great push against Japan. Because of its huge weight-carrying capability, the Old Lady became an indispensable addition to the war in the Pacific. During the bloody fight for Iwo Jima, she carried tons of precious plasma across the Pacific. Before retirement in March 1945, she would carry over 3 million pounds of personnel and supplies, completing 78 round trips between San Francisco Bay and Honolulu. So satisfied was the Navy that 20 improved versions were ordered in January 1945. Glenn L. Martin himself could not have been more pleased.
The Mars flying boat, wingspread 200 feet, height almost 45 feet, largest yet in operation. At Baltimore, the first of a fleet of 20, the Hawaii Mars, is ready for flight. 19 others, named after Pacific islands, will join her in the Naval Air Transport Service. Down to the water for a takeoff. The Mars is more than 120 feet long and weighs 72.5 tons.
Martin got the publicity he wanted and made sure the Navy got what it wanted. Designated the JRM-1, the Hawaii Mars was built as a cargo transport from the start, unlike the prototype. Greater cargo space, larger hatches, and a huge cargo hoist mounted underneath the wing were incorporated. A single vertical stabilizer and rudder that replaced the Old Lady's twin tail fins, however, was the most noticeable difference. Stronger engines and increased fuel storage promised greater range and lifting capacity. But less than 2 weeks after the Hawaii Mars was christened, its career was snuffed out over the Chesapeake Bay. The giant aircraft was lost on August 5, 1945, during an attempted landing. When the sunken wreck was recovered, the cause was evident. The leading edge of the vertical stabilizer had failed. The crew salvaged the twisted body, but damage was such that plans to rebuild the Hawaii Mars were abandoned. Instead, it was disposed of for scrap. Undaunted, Martin continued production. World War II ended the following month, and post-war cutbacks scaled the original order of 20 JRMs down to 5. For the next 11 years, the mighty Mars would continue to ply the Pacific Airways, breaking its own weight-carrying records and serving the Navy with great distinction. Glenn L. Martin had found a happy customer in the U.S. Navy, But he had no intention of stopping there. He had hoped the Mars would be a forerunner to a fleet of giant commercial flying boats. The Martin Company produced this promotional film, illustrating what the Mars could offer as a passenger airliner. Harkening to the glory days of the Pan Am Clippers, each sketch featured images of plush accommodations. Sitting areas, a saloon, washrooms, and a lounge. For Martin, the age of the commercial flying boat was just beginning. But in the post-war era, it was the beginning of the end. Airline companies were now turning to large four-engine land planes. Even Pan American Airways, champion of the Clipper flying boats, had given up on water-based aircraft. The future lay in fixed airstrips and large airports. Huge airfields that were built during the war now made traveling more convenient, and cities without suitable water facilities could now be linked to overseas air travel. Passengers still enjoyed the pleasantries introduced by the great Clippers, but the days of touching down on a water runway were fading fast. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a British aircraft company apparently had refused to step to the march of progress. The Saunders-Roe Company, in 1946, acted upon an order to build the largest commercial flying boat ever intended for airline use, the SR-45 Princess. The British Air Ministry had suggested that the British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC, would want the 10-engine monster for its transatlantic routes. The nationalized company BOAC, however, did not share the government's enthusiasm. Nevertheless, Saunders-Roe started on 3 prototypes at their plant in Cowes, Isle of Wight, despite BOAC's lack of commitment to the Air Ministry. The next 6 years of development, construction, and testing would be plagued by delays, miscalculation, and, in no small measure, wishful thinking. With the arrival of the jet age and the advances being made in small, high-speed aircraft, construction of the Princess could appear only as a leap into the past. Despite appearances, however, the Princess would incorporate some advanced concepts. Its 2-deck hull, called the double bubble section, would include hull pressurization and air conditioning systems, in which Saunders-Roe broke a great deal of new ground. Another advanced addition to this giant was the gas turbine engine, whose development, at the time, was still in its infancy. But the higher power-weight ratio compared to the traditional piston-driven engine had encouraged Saunders-Roe to persevere in this mammoth undertaking. The Bristol Proteus II propeller turbine was finally selected. 4 contra-rotating pairs and 2 single outboard engines, for a total of 10 units, were installed. Unfortunately, this underdeveloped engine would become the major source of delay and problems in final testing. By August of 1952, the first prototype was finally completed, some 3 years after the originally projected flight date. The Princess was enormous. Its hull measured 148 feet long, height 55 feet, wingspan 219.5 feet, nearly 20 feet wider and 10 feet taller than the Mars. Launching was scheduled at Cowes for August 19th, but due to a strong northeast wind, it was postponed. 2 days later, just after midnight, the Princess was finally lowered into the water. Its dependence on suitable sea conditions only underscored one of the drawbacks of flying boats. On August 22nd, the Princess was ready to take to the air. The flight crew of 11 boarded the plane and conducted taxiing tests before making their takeoff. Despite the numerous delays, the Princess was considered a technical success. At the time, it was the heaviest all-metal passenger transport ever built, as well as the largest aircraft powered by gas turbines. The greatest technical breakthrough lay in the power control system. Muscle power had been considered unrealistic, and therefore the rudder, elevators, and ailerons were power-assisted with hydraulic boosts. The captain reported excellent air and water handling characteristics, but the Bristol Proteus II engines were grossly underpowered. Advertised at 3,500 horsepower, they actually delivered only 2,500. The Proteus III, to be installed in the definitive model, had not been ready in 1952. Final installation would have promised further delay, but the Princess and the flying boat in general were already operating on borrowed time. On September 2nd, the Princess made its public debut at the Farnborough Air Show. There was no doubt that the giant flying boat impressed the crowd. Those impressions, however, were almost dreadfully altered. The pilot had taken the Princess to such a high speed that he experienced tremendous difficulty rolling back to level flight. An accident was just barely averted. Despite its successful flights, the Princess's future was uncertain at best. Plans for a 105-seat capacity with luxurious accommodations were never implemented. And BOAC continued to hedge on its intentions for the enormous craft. As early as February 1951, it had been unofficially announced that the third prototype would be scrapped to save money. And in March, it was suggested that the Princess be used by the Royal Air Force for troop transport, again indicating BOAC's lack of interest. This plan, too, was met with lukewarm support. The Princess made its final public appearance in September 1953 in a new finish of blue, yellow, and white livery. The entire Princess program ceased in June the following year. With no orders for the giant flying boat, the Air Ministry decided to cocoon all three Princess models. Coats of preservative polyvinyl plastic were applied to prevent deterioration. As a flying boat, the Princess had performed extremely well, both aero and hydrodynamically. But as a viable alternative to its more efficient and speedy land-based contemporaries, it was doomed from the start. The Princess would never lead a new generation of flying boats, but instead suffer the indignity of mummification. Until 1965, all three Princess models remained in a dormant state. But that year, workmen began dismantling the second and third prototypes for intended use by NASA in the United States as a transport vehicle for the Saturn V. This was the famous rocket booster that would launch the first manned satellite to orbit the moon. Typical of the princess's experience, however, this order came to nothing. With the second and third models scrapped, the only princess ever to fly was coaxed into the water and towed to a wrecker's yard in Southampton in April 1967. This was the last flying boat ever built for airline use, a victim of its time. As she was begrudgingly nudged to her thankless end, the procession represented a symbolic requiem for the flying boat.
The huge fuselage for the world's largest aircraft leaves its hangar in California to begin the 24-mile overland journey to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. One wing alone measures 165 feet, and the huge seaplane, when completed, will be powered by 8 3,000-horsepower engines. En route to a special graving dock, linesmen cut wires and shift poles to provide clearance for the huge plane. The mammoth hull will rest in this graving dock while the plane is assembled. As yet unnamed, the craft was designed as a cargo carrier, but it could be easily adapted to transport 700 passengers. This, the latest and largest transport plane, opens new horizons in man's conquest of the sky.
The H-4 Hercules, more commonly known as the Spruce Goose. It was a giant among giants, the largest aircraft ever built. Its short but fascinating story is matched only by its eccentric designer. Howard Hughes, oil millionaire, movie producer, and breaker of aviation records in the 1930s and 40s. It was Hughes' unyielding determination and aeronautical expertise that carried the project through to completion despite the many obstacles along the way. Originally, 3 of these Leviathans were ordered by the U.S. government in 1942 as an answer to the German U-boat threat against Allied shipping during World War II. As conceived, these flying boats would airlift enormous quantities of men and supplies across the Atlantic Ocean non-stop, thus avoiding any contact with submarines. In addition, the entire aircraft was to be built with materials considered non-essential to the war effort. The hull, wings, and tail assembly, everything but the engines, engine mounts, and hardware, were constructed of laminated wood, mostly birch, not spruce. But by 1944, the first aircraft had not yet been completed, although much of the original $18 million allocated had been spent. Discouraged, the War Production Board decided to terminate the project. Many in the government considered Hughes a reckless playboy and questioned his integrity regarding the entire project. Luckily, President Roosevelt suggested that at least one of the aircraft should be completed, and a new agreement was reached. Hughes forged ahead, though he was close to a nervous breakdown. By November 1947, after 4 years of engineering problems, material shortages, and lack of skilled labor, Hughes was ready to take the monster flying boat on its first taxi test. Hughes' critics had been relentless. In July, Senate subcommittee hearings had been held to determine if he had improperly influenced government officials in gaining more contracts. Hughes vehemently defended the project before members of Congress, rebuking those that claimed he had built an airplane that could never fly. On November 2nd, after inviting the national press and members of the Senate Investigative Committee, Hughes took the controls of the H-4 and began the scheduled demonstration of its water handling capabilities. It was an impressive sight. The wingspan measured 320 feet. That's longer than a football field and twice the distance that the Wright brothers had flown their first airplane. The tail was nearly 10 stories high. The crowd was surely impressed, but in moments, the unexpected was at hand. As the H-4 reached 90 miles per hour, it lifted into the air.
We are airborne, ladies and gentlemen. We're truly up in the air. And I don't know Howard, did you expect that? Sadly, I like to make surprises. You were surprised? No, I thought I'd make a surprise.
Surprised they were. The plane could fly. But this would be its only flight, just 1 mile. Hughes felt vindicated nonetheless. Whether or not he had planned the flight is still a mystery, as is why the aircraft was never flown again. The Hughes flying boat rests in dry dock to this day, and still remains as much a curiosity as its enigmatic creator. Unlike the Saunders-Roe Princess or the H-4, the Martin Mars was a success in the truest sense of the word. In its 15 years with the U.S. Navy, including the old lady's wartime service, the Mars logged more than 87,000 accident-free flight hours, flying over 200,000 passengers, a total of almost 12 million miles. From troop transport to cargo supply, and even as air ambulance. One of its most unusual rescue missions was Operation Hayride. The Marshall Mars was called in to drop several tons of hay and several containers of worms to replenish the food stores of a ship transporting 6 elephants and a large variety of tropical birds. Thanks to the Marshall Mars' huge storage capacity, the hungry animals arrived safely to their destination. Unfortunately, the Marshall Mars would be lost to fire during flight tests in 1950. But the remaining 4 giants, the Philippine, Marianas, Caroline, and a second Hawaii Mars, kept the Navy proud until 1956, when they were decommissioned. Apparently, the Navy had no more use for them. But someone else would. After a string of devastating fire seasons in the late 1950s, a group of Canadian timber companies formed an organization that would forever change the odds in fighting forest fires. Forest Industries Flying Tankers. FIFT owes over 30 years of successful firefighting to a 50-year-old giant. On Sproat Lake in Vancouver Island, British Columbia, the last 2 remaining Mars aircraft are still operating as the most effective water bombers ever used. For one simple reason: size. After FIFT purchased the remaining 4 Mars in 1959, each was modified to hold a 6,000-gallon plywood water tank with release doors in either the bottom or sides of the hull. Ian Thomas explains.
This is LYK, the side dropper Philippine Mars. This is our water tank that we carry the water in. It comes in the back and through the probes, comes through the door system, and loads up in through a set of flapper doors. The tank is broken into 4 sections. We can either drop the front section or the rear section, but usually when we're dropping on a fire, we drop all 4 sections at once, just so that we have an avenue out that all our weight is gone.
In their second life as water bombers, the Mars have once again led a career of outstanding performance. Up to 40 fires have been snuffed out each year. Within 10 minutes, the Mars can be in the air and make a 6,000-gallon drop every 15 minutes. That's 30 tons of water per drop. The fire missions, however, are often few and far between. Some would say the greatest challenge to operating these old workhorses is the maintenance. Every morning, the flight crews run a thorough check on each aircraft so that they're ready to go when the fire bell sounds. No new parts are being built for a 50-year-old aircraft. When the 4 Mars were first purchased, fortunately they came with 35 additional engines and nearly 90 tons of spare parts. But 30-plus years of operation makes no supply seem unlimited. After 2 of the 4 Mars were lost in the early 60s, the Caroline in a hurricane and the Marianas during a fire mission, the remaining 2 became even more precious. Especially to the crew who takes care of them. Ian Thomas.
Well, I was originally born and raised here in Port Alberni, and these aircraft were on the lake as I grew up. And seeing them, I kind of always wanted to sort of get around aircraft and had it as a hobby.
For an enthusiast, the Martin Mars is a unique aircraft, and this job is certainly one of a kind.
It changes every day, that every day you're not doing the same thing, that we're not fighting a fire, we're doing maintenance of one sort or the other. It's routine, and yet the place and the airplanes are part of you. It's a great crew. Everybody gets along. Everybody looks after one another. We care about one another. You're not just a number in a mill or in a factory. That everybody's got a personality and everybody knows everybody, and it's nice.
Much of that close camaraderie comes from highly efficient teamwork. As flight engineer, Ian Thomas knows that a successful and safe mission depends on his flawless interaction with the pilot.
Pilot has the eyes. I am sitting 30 feet back. I can't really see what's going on. I rely on him, but then he relies on me to maintain the aircraft and operate the engines when he needs the power to get out of a jam or to function in his movement of the aircraft. He relies on me to maintain and achieve that power settings that he's desiring.
To become a pilot is no small task. Applicants must have no less than 7,000 hours of flying time, specifically in water-based aircraft on the British Columbia coast. Chief pilot Jack Waddington remembers the first time flying the giant Mars.
The first time that I recall flying the aircraft, I know it. I was in great awe of it. Somewhat intimidated. It's very slow to respond, both power-wise and on the controls. The first time you take control of the aircraft, you kind of say to yourself, "My Lord, what have I got a hold of here?" But It comes around after a while. It's very much, I would have to say, the ultimate flying boat. It's the largest operational flying boat there is, and there's nothing can compare with it.
Pilot Reg Young.
I enjoyed flying the aircraft right from the start. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I couldn't seem to get enough of it. On my first flight, I took the controls and did a complete takeoff and landing, and it was super. Like every pilot, you see a new aircraft, you want to fly it. When I saw the Mars, I was hooked. I mean, I had to fly it.
Well, I think there's two things that really make this aircraft ideally suited to water bombing. Number one being a flying boat. We have water everywhere here. We're never any more than 10 minutes away from water, whether it be fresh water or salt water, it doesn't matter. The other thing that makes this aircraft ideally suited is it's a simple aircraft. What we refer to in the aviation community as the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. That applies to a lot of different things, but I think with aircraft firefighting and water bombing, that you definitely do want a simple aircraft, not an aircraft that's overly complicated. The more complicated they are, the more things there are to go wrong with it.
They're number 3 for Pope, really.
Well, it's kind of a neat airplane to fly. The whole aircraft is flown through intercom. The pilot's in command, passes the commands out to the flight crew. And the main commands are between the pilot and the flight engineer sitting on the flight panel 30 feet behind you.
Clear 4.
The pilot applies the power for takeoff, and as soon as you get directional control with a little bit of speed, pass the power back to the flight engineer and he adjusts the power for you. From then on, you call commands for whatever power settings you want, whether you're in a climb or a cruise attitude. He manages your fuel system, does all your electrical system, all your fire warning system. Important guy back there. His job is to inform the pilot if anything goes wrong, and the pilot will make the decision on how to handle it.
On fire missions, teamwork not only applies to the flight crew, but to the aircraft as well. Crucial to operations is the bird dog, a Grumman goose amphibian. It serves as a spotter for the ground-based fire boss who directs the entire air and land firefighting operation. The bird dog not only provides reconnaissance, but also leads the bomber in for the drop. It takes a crew of 4 to operate the Mars on fire missions: pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and flight mechanic. This is going to be a practice drop. The apparent air of relaxation belies the surge of adrenaline triggered by a true fire call.
Well, here on the base, when the bell goes off, when you have a fire call, you're usually sitting back, kind of relaxed, not really thinking of having to go to a fire. It's like any city fire hall, the crew's sitting around waiting for the call out. But when the call out goes, gets the old adrenaline flowing, you jump up and you're gone. You're down the boat and onto that aircraft, and the sooner you get to the fire, the better job you're going to do.
FIFT's 4 pilots are the only 4 men in the world certified to fly these aircraft. They've been called the world's most exclusive club of airline pilots. But to Jack Waddington, flying the Mars is just another job.
Well, it's all very second nature to us now. It's, I consider it, I've been trained to do the job, and it's just like anyone that's been trained to do a job. You're trained to do it, and it becomes second nature to you after a while. It's just like getting in a car and driving it.
Not exactly the car that you get into every morning. But as the pilots would argue, after extensive training and operational flying, getting into Mars does become second nature. This is important because the forest fire is an extremely unpredictable enemy. The Mars was not designed to maneuver through rugged terrain at treetop levels while attacking a deceptive enemy. This became horribly evident in 1961 when the pilot of the Marianas Mars attacked a fire uphill. Upon a steep turn away from the mountain, the port wing clipped the trees, and the aircraft cartwheeled into the mountainside, killing the entire crew. Since then, FIFT management has insisted that pilots are as familiar with the terrain as they are with water-based aircraft. That is the first requirement. The second is teamwork. Once the flight crew takes the Mars into the air, procedure is everything. Every step of operation is planned out. There are no last-minute changes or actions based on whim. Too much is at risk for the aircraft and especially for the crew. 30-odd years of perfecting that procedure has saved millions of dollars worth of timber. But in penetrating the remote areas of the island, following procedure demands a great degree of skill.
Well, the forest industry has changed. Now all the lowlands are logged off. The logging has moved into the mountainous country. So naturally the fires are in that area created by operations. And we're going more into the mountainous terrain, valleys, block canyons, and it calls for a lot more skill and types of flying to get in there to get at the target, which is the fire.
This is an old fire site that got out of control before the Mars was finally called in.
Well, the old technique was they used to wait till the fire got completely out of control. They tried to fight it with small helicopters. Then they would call us in there, and I mean, the thing was burning everywhere. Open flame, 20, 30 feet in the air. We'd come in there, and in an hour, it was out. Now, when we get some type of fire in any of the logging operations, they call us out. We're in there, and we put it out. I mean, our whole drop pattern, 2 to 3 acres, covers the fire. And we have it out in an hour. So the idea is initial attack, get on the fire as soon as possible and get it out.
Filling the 6,000-gallon water tank takes about 40 seconds. At 80 miles per hour, the Mars skims the lake's surface, forcing the water into 2 probes, looking like enormous ice cream scoops that extend aft of the step. It's not as difficult as it sounds.
Scooping the load is really no big, heavy problem. You fly it the same as any other aircraft. You always pick up into wind. But once you get the aircraft airborne, then you're just a heavy, slow-flying aircraft that's slow to maneuver. You need lots of room to get your speed up, to climb out. It's 10 times slower than when you're empty. I mean, I've had it so that I'm sitting there with my left wing down, crank full aileron over to bring it up. I mean, cranked right over. Nothing happens for seconds and seconds. You can eat up a mile of airspace before the thing finally starts to move, and then when it does move, it just comes up slow. And it's heavy. There's no boost on the aileron. You have to have a plan to fly the airplane on operations. You just don't come around the corner and everything happens unexpected. Your bird dog's there before you, tells you what to expect, so you're all set up. It's up for the pilot to maneuver the aircraft on final to the proper drop height and let the load go just by eyeballing what's happening outside relative to your speed.
30 tons of water laced with foam concentrate to ensure deep saturation comes crashing down like a thunder shower. But rarely is one pass enough. A bad fire can require a crew to make 25 drops per sortie, 2 sorties a day, and there's no room for error.
You're fighting the air currents, the weight of the aircraft, smoke, and mountainous areas. That's the hazards of this type of flying.
But the fires get put out. In over 30 years, the Mars have not yet let a fire get away from them. Without them, it would take ground firefighting crews a week to snuff out a remote fire, if they could even get to it. There are hazards, yes, but compensation could be found in the beautiful surroundings this group calls its workplace. An appeal that seaplanes have always had over land planes. Perhaps the greatest appeal of seaplanes is found in the places they take you.
Well, flying this aircraft and in any seaplane application, every runway is different. You're always going to different places, different water conditions. I think that's probably what got me into the seaplane flying business in the first place. Somewhat now, I guess 30 years now.
And as for flying boats, the Mars is the granddaddy of them all. Not a bad combination.
These 2 aircraft, probably the last of the flying boats you'll ever see. I don't think you'll ever see them again. It's going to be a sad day, I think, when they eventually do go. We're trying to keep them going just as long as we possibly can. We're not abusing them. We have great respect for them. It's definitely an era gone by, but we've still got 2 of them flying here, and they're doing one hell of a good job.
Perhaps only Glenn L. Martin could have imagined 50 years ago that his flying boat would still be flying today. Maybe not as a firefighter, but flying boats were always known to be versatile. The Mars survived a time in which aviation saw the magnitude of flying boats as a liability. Today, that has become its greatest asset. But the Hawaii and Philippine Mars are more than just remarkable aircraft, especially to the crew.
They're just a part of you that it becomes your sort of baby, that you look after it and you maintain it and keep it in flying condition. It hurts to see somebody else break it.